He thought he was firing me in front of the executive floor to make an example out of me. What he didn't realize was that the badge I placed in his lawyer's palm carried board clearance and a silent record of everything they thought I'd never see. The executive floor always smelled like polished stone and expensive coffee, the kind brewed to suggest power rather than taste. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind the CEO like a carefully staged backdrop, the city glittering below as if it, too, reported to him. I stood at the end of the long walnut table, my reflection faint in its lacquered surface, watching him rehearse authority in real time. "Security will escort you," he said, smooth and measured, as though he were announcing a quarterly dividend. A ripple moved through the room. Vice presidents avoiding eye contact, legal pretending to scroll, HR folding their hands with theatrical regret. I felt the first wave. A flash of heat under my collarbone, humiliation wrapped in fluorescent light. I had built the compliance architecture that kept this company audit-proof for 5 years, and now I was the problem. But the heat cooled quickly, because I knew something he didn't. He gestured toward the door. 2 security officers waited there, polite and immovable. The CEO leaned back, satisfied, as if this were the neat conclusion to a minor inconvenience. My badge lay warm against my palm. Badge access, my name engraved beneath the company logo, the tiny embedded chip holding more permissions than most people in that room had ever needed. He assumed it was just plastic. I walked toward legal instead. The company counsel, sharp suit, sharper smile, extended his hand automatically. "We'll need your access credentials immediately," he said. "Of course," I replied, and placed the badge in his palm. He glanced down, ready to pass it off to IT. Then he stopped. A silence bloomed between us. His thumb brushed the edge of the chip, then the faint gold band near the bottom, an upgrade invisible unless you knew what to look for. His eyes flicked to mine, searching for something. Permission? Denial? A bluff? "Is there a problem?" the CEO asked, impatience tapping beneath his calm. Counsel didn't answer at first. He turned the badge over, once, twice. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "This has board clearance," he said quietly. The air changed. It was subtle, like a pressure shift before a storm. Someone at the far end of the table straightened. The CFO's pen stopped moving. Board clearance wasn't decorative, it wasn't symbolic, it was forensic-level access. Time-stamped logs, oversight permissions granted only when internal review required independent channels. It wasn't something an employee accidentally had, and it certainly wasn't something you revoked without documentation. The CEO's smile faltered. Barely. "That's impossible." "It's not," counsel replied. "This badge triggers automatic archival routing. Forensics will need to review its activity before deactivation." Forensics. The word fell into the room like a dropped glass. I kept my face still, though inside something steadied, like a ship finding its keel. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't argued. I had simply followed procedure. The same procedure they had signed off on 6 months ago when the board mandated independent oversight on select internal operations. They had assumed the oversight would never look inward. Security remained by the door, now uncertain. The CEO's gaze returned to me, sharper this time. "Why?" he asked slowly. "Would you have board-level routing?" Because 3 months ago I noticed irregular expense relocations masked as infrastructure upgrades. Because I documented them. Because I escalated them exactly as policy required. Because the board responded quietly. But I didn't say any of that. "You authorized expanded compliance monitoring," I said instead. "After the audit scare last spring." A flicker crossed his expression. He remembered. He just hadn't expected the mechanism to be real. Counsel cleared his throat. "We'll need to suspend the termination until review. Standard process." Standard process. The phrase wrapped itself around the CEO like a tightening thread. The humiliation I'd felt minutes earlier shifted into something else. Not triumph, not yet, but clarity. They thought they were removing a liability. They had, in fact, activated a record. Outside the windows, clouds drifted lazily across the skyline, indifferent. Inside, tension sharpened the air. The CEO leaned forward. "You went to the board." It wasn't a question. "I followed protocol," I said. Another silence, this one heavier. Someone at the table shifted in their seat. Someone else finally looked at me directly, not with pity, but with calculation. The narrative had changed, and they felt it. Counsel handed the badge to IT, but not casually. "Get forensics," he said. "Full activity trace." The CEO's jaw set. "This is an internal matter." "With board clearance," counsel replied carefully, "it isn't only internal." There it was, the fracture line. I gathered my notebook from the table slowly, giving the moment space to breathe. I wasn't escorted out. I wasn't stopped either. The security officers stepped aside. Not deferential, just unsure. As I walked toward the door, I felt the second wave. Anger, sharp and electric. Not because they tried to fire me, but because they assumed I would disappear quietly. In the hallway, the executive carpet muffled my steps. Behind the closed conference doors, voices rose. Controlled, tense. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because something had shifted upstairs and everyone knew it. And once forensics opened that log, nothing would remain theoretical. Some opportunities only knock once, and some windows close forever if you're not there to watch them open. The elevator ride down from the executive floor felt longer than it ever had. Not because of the distance, but because of the silence. The polished steel walls reflected my face back at me, composed, steady, almost detached. Inside, though, everything hummed. My phone vibrated again. Unknown number. This time I answered. "Stay available," a calm voice said. Not a greeting, not a question. "Forensics has initiated badge access tracing." The line clicked dead. No name, no signature, just confirmation. I stepped out into the lobby where light spilled through the glass atrium in clean architectural lines. Employees crossed the marble floor with coffee cups and laptops, unaware that upstairs, the tectonic plates of the company had shifted half an inch. It never looks dramatic from the outside. Corporate earthquakes are silent. My inbox exploded before I reached the cafe across the street. Subject lines stacked like dominoes. Urgent. Access review. Board clearance clarification needed. Immediate hold on termination. I didn't open them. Not yet. Instead, I ordered tea. Something simple, something grounding. Steam rose in thin ribbons, vanishing as quickly as certainty had in that boardroom. Around me, mid-level managers gossiped about market rumors and vendor delays. No one mentioned my name, which meant the news hadn't filtered down. But it would. My phone buzzed again. This time from IT operations. "Can you confirm whether you authorized secondary archival routing?" the message read. There it was, the thread. 6 months ago, after the audit scare, I'd recommended a layered monitoring system, one that quietly duplicated sensitive executive approvals into a sealed channel accessible only under board clearance. The CEO had approved it in writing, dismissing it as procedural paranoia. He'd signed faster than he'd read. I responded with one sentence. "Refer to the April 14th Compliance Memorandum, Section 4.2. 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared. Across the street, the glass facade of headquarters shimmered in the afternoon sun, deceptively serene. Inside those walls, forensics would now be pulling activity logs tied to my badge. Every timestamp, every triggered archive, every mirrored authorization. Badge access wasn't power, it was memory, and memory in the right hands is indisputable. A call came in from legal. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. "We need you back upstairs," counsel said. Voice measured but thinner than before. "There are discrepancies in executive-level overrides tied to your monitoring system." "Discrepancies?" I repeated. A pause. Paper shuffling. Someone whispering in the background. "Approvals executed under emergency protocol without secondary documentation." Emergency protocol. That was the key phrase. The shortcut. The rarely used bypass designed for crisis scenarios. It allowed temporary override of standard review chains, provided documentation followed within 48 hours, documentation that apparently did not exist. I felt the third wave rise. Hope, cautious and controlled. Not hope for revenge, hope for clarity. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said. When I returned to the executive floor, the atmosphere had changed. The receptionist avoided my eyes, not out of dismissal, but because she didn't know which version of me she was supposed to acknowledge: terminated employee or protected witness. Inside the conference room, screens now displayed columns of data. Timestamps glowed in sterile blue rows. Forensics analysts, quiet, clinical, stood beside the display like surgeons reviewing scans. The CEO remained seated, posture rigid. Counsel gestured to the screen. "Your board." Clearance routing captured mirrored approvals executed under emergency protocol on 3 separate occasions. The analyst tapped a key. 3 dates appeared, all within the last quarter, all tied to financial reallocations masked as infrastructure upgrades. My pulse steadied. "Were you aware of these overrides?" Counsel asked the CEO carefully. The CEO's expression was controlled, but something brittle edged his tone. "Executive discretion is not a criminal act." "No one said criminal," Counsel replied. "Not yet." Forensic zoomed in on one transaction. The system displayed a missing attachment, required documentation never uploaded. A red flag icon blinked beside it. 1 flag could be oversight. 3 formed a pattern. I stepped closer to the screen. Careful, measured. The monitoring system auto-archives executive emergency overrides for board review if documentation is incomplete within 48 hours. Silence. The analyst nodded. "That's correct." "And were they reviewed?" I asked. The analyst hesitated. "That's the issue," he said. "The review request was generated. It was never acknowledged." The CEO's hand tightened on the edge of the table. In that moment, sympathy flickered through me, not for him, but for the illusion of untouchability that was quietly unraveling. Power isn't loud when it cracks. It whispers. The CFO shifted in his chair. This could trigger mandatory board inquiry. Not could. It would. The CEO looked at me then, not furious, not shouting, assessing. "You engineered this," he said. "No," I replied evenly. "I engineered compliance." Another silence. This one final. Outside the windows, the city moved as always, traffic flowing, sunlight fading toward evening. Inside, the room felt smaller, as though the glass walls had drawn inward. Counsel straightened his papers. "Given the findings, termination is suspended pending board review. Additionally, external forensics may be retained to ensure independent validation." External, the word echoed. The CEO said nothing. I gathered my notebook again. This time, no one blocked my path. No one mentioned security. No one asked for my badge. It remained in an evidence tray at the center of the table, small and gleaming under fluorescent light. A simple rectangle of plastic that had remembered everything. As I reached the door, Counsel spoke once more. "Until this is resolved," he said carefully, "your board clearance remains active." Active. Behind me, chairs shifted. Screens flickered. The illusion of quiet control had been replaced with something far less comfortable: accountability. And once the board officially opened that file, the story would no longer belong to the executive floor. Some doors don't reopen once the board walks through them. If you've ever watched power shift in a single quiet moment, tell me, would you have handed over the badge or held it tighter? By the time the official notice arrived, the building felt different. Not visibly. The marble floors still reflected ceiling lights in perfect symmetry. Assistants still moved briskly with tablets clutched like shields. But conversations cut off half a second earlier when I passed. Smiles arrived delayed, carefully measured. The executive floor had developed a pulse, tight, watchful. The board had opened a formal inquiry. It wasn't dramatic. No public announcement, no press release, just a confidential memorandum routed through board clearance channels and copied to legal, forensics, and, quietly, to me. Subject line: Preliminary Review of Executive Emergency Overrides. I read it standing by the window in my office, an office I technically wasn't supposed to still have. Across the skyline, clouds gathered in thin gray layers, soft and deceptive. The city looked as though nothing significant could possibly be happening inside the glass tower behind me. But inside, documents were being preserved, email archives frozen, financial logs sealed. Memory was hardening into evidence. An internal message from IT appeared on my screen. All executive-level emergency protocols temporarily suspended pending review. That was fast. Emergency protocol had been the unspoken lever, the mechanism executives trusted to move resources without friction. Its suspension wasn't a headline, but it was a signal. Something serious had been acknowledged. My phone rang. This time, the caller ID displayed a private extension from the board liaison's office. "Thank you for your cooperation," the voice said, measured, neutral. "External forensics will begin independent validation tomorrow. You may be contacted for clarification on system architecture." "I understand," I replied. A pause lingered. "Your monitoring structure was thorough," the voice added, "more thorough than anticipated." There it was again, the subtle shift. Not praise, recognition. After the call ended, I allowed myself a single steady breath. Not relief, not victory, just the quiet confirmation that documentation, when done correctly, speaks for itself. Across the hall, I noticed movement inside the CEO's office, blinds partially drawn, 2 board members seated opposite him, counsel present. No raised voices, just stillness, the kind that precedes consequences. For a moment, a flicker of doubt brushed my thoughts. What if this dissolved into a technical explanation? What if emergency overrides were reframed as strategic urgency? Corporate narratives have a way of rearranging facts, but facts, when mirrored into sealed channels, are stubborn. An email notification chimed. External forensics had accessed the archived routing. I opened the dashboard. Activity logs scrolled in precise chronological order. Timestamp. Authorization ID, emergency override code, missing documentation flag, 3 entries, then a 4th. I blinked. The 4th override had occurred 2 days after my termination. Meeting had first been scheduled internally. It had not been flagged earlier because documentation had been uploaded, exactly 47 hours later, within compliance threshold. But the attached file was labeled generically, supplemental justification.pdf. I clicked it. Blank. Not corrupted, not inaccessible. Blank. A hollow document placed just inside the 48-hour window to satisfy system requirements. A clever maneuver, almost clever enough. I forwarded the file to external forensics with a single note. Attachment content appears empty. Minutes later, confirmation arrived. File metadata indicates document created 3 minutes prior to upload. No prior draft history. Which meant the override had been executed without justification, and the justification had been staged. The wave that rose now wasn't anger. It was something colder, precision. A knock sounded at my office door. The CFO stood there, not with defensiveness, not with authority, with calculation. "Can we speak?" he asked. We sat across from each other in the muted light of late afternoon. The skyline had shifted toward amber, casting long reflections across the glass walls. "You've made your point," he began carefully. "I followed policy," I replied. He exhaled through his nose. "The board is considering interim leadership adjustments." Adjustments, a word designed to soften impact. "Emergency protocol was meant for volatility," he continued. "Not this. Not undocumented reallocations, not blank justifications." He studied me for a moment. "What do you want?" The question hovered. Not revenge, not apology. "I want the monitoring system to remain independent," I said, "and protected." He leaned back slightly. "That's all?" "That's enough." Silence stretched between us, threaded with unspoken acknowledgments. Because he understood something fundamental now. This wasn't personal. It was structural, and structures outlast individuals. As he left my office, another message appeared on my screen. Board convening emergency session at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Emergency session. The irony was almost poetic. Outside, the sky darkened fully. The building lights flickered on in steady rows. From the street, it would look like another long corporate evening, executives working late, decisions being made. But inside, the architecture of authority was being redrawn quietly, line by line. My badge remained active. Board clearance unchanged, and for the first time since that morning in the conference room, I felt something solid settle beneath my ribs. Not triumph, not yet, but inevitability. At 7:42 a.m., the executive floor was quieter than I had ever seen it. No assistants rushing with color-coded folders, no pre-meeting laughter. Even the espresso machine in the corner cafe seemed to hiss more cautiously, as if aware that steam alone could not soften what was about to happen. The emergency board session began at 8 sharp. I wasn't invited into the room. That, in itself, told me everything. Board sessions involving executive review follow strict boundaries. Independence requires distance. My role wasn't to argue or accuse. My role had already been fulfilled through architecture, timestamps, mirrored approvals, through memory. At 8:03, my inbox chimed. Executive emergency protocol suspended indefinitely. 3 minutes later, another notification. Interim oversight committee activated. The oversight committee hadn't existed before this week. It was written into bylaws as a dormant safeguard, activated only when internal governance required temporary restructuring. Temporary. That word carries more weight than people realize. Across the glass corridor, I saw the CEO walking toward the boardroom, not leading, not followed, escorted by counsel and 2 board members. His posture remained upright, but the rhythm of his stride had changed. Less command, more calculation. I felt a flicker of something unexpected, not satisfaction, recognition, power. When challenged by systems it once dismissed, often attempts one last display of confidence. But systems do not respond to tone, they respond to documentation. My phone vibrated. External forensics. Metadata review complete, the analyst said without preamble. Blank attachment was intentionally generated to satisfy compliance timestamp. Pattern consistent with avoidance, not oversight. Avoidance. The word carried a sterile finality. Thank you, I replied. No dramatics, no raised voices, just confirmation. Outside, morning sunlight cut sharply through the skyline, illuminating dust motes suspended in still air. It felt almost cinematic, the way clarity sometimes arrives on an ordinary Tuesday. At 8:47, the boardroom doors opened. No one rushed out. No visible confrontation. Only a slow, deliberate exit of individuals who had just recalibrated a hierarchy. The CFO avoided my gaze. Counsel did not. He approached me directly. The board has initiated interim leadership restructuring effective immediately, he said carefully. The CEO will step aside pending formal review. Step aside. Corporate language is an art form. It cushions impact without denying gravity. And the monitoring system, I asked, will remain active under independent reporting. Independent, protected. A quiet exhale left my lungs before I could stop it. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Additionally, the board would like you to serve as liaison during the transition. Your familiarity with the compliance architecture is indispensable. Indispensable. A week ago, I was disposable. I nodded once. Understood. From inside the boardroom, I could see the CEO gathering his portfolio. No security escort, no spectacle. Just a man adjusting to a new reality he hadn't anticipated. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the corridor. There was no anger there now, only comprehension. He had relied on urgency as leverage. I had relied on structure as anchor. One bends, the other endures. By mid-morning, an internal memo circulated company-wide. Commitment to governance and transparency. Carefully worded, optimistic, forward-looking. Employees read it between meetings, whispering interpretations over lunch. Rumors moved quickly, but facts moved faster this time, because the facts were archived. Around noon, I walked past the evidence tray in legal. My badge rested there, small and unassuming. Badge access, board clearance, forensics. 3 phrases that had once sounded procedural now carried the weight of quiet revolution. Counsel noticed me glance at it. You'll need this, he said, handing it back. The plastic felt cool against my palm. Active, not as a weapon, as a safeguard. When I stepped back onto the executive floor with it clipped to my jacket, the atmosphere shifted once more. Not with fear, not with applause, but with recalibration. Structures were being reinforced. Policies rewritten with sharper language, emergency protocols redesigned with layered authentication. Not because I demanded it, because evidence required it. Late that afternoon, an email from the board chair arrived. Your adherence to policy prevented material risk. The organization appreciates your diligence. Simple, direct, no theatrics. I closed my laptop and looked out at the city again. Traffic streamed below in orderly lines, unaware that inside this tower, governance had quietly corrected itself. There was no parade, no headline, just alignment. And in that alignment, something rare settled into place. Accountability had arrived without noise, and it had stayed. The first week after the restructuring felt strangely ordinary. That was the most surreal part. No dramatic announcements, no sudden applause in hallways. Just calendar invites multiplying like quiet proof that the machine was still running. Only now it was running differently. The Interim Oversight Committee occupied the former executive strategy room. The long walnut table remained, but the seating arrangement had changed. Authority no longer radiated from one end. It circled. My role as liaison was precise. Clarify system architecture, ensure board clearance routing remained independent, and assist external forensics with final documentation. Nothing more, nothing less. On Tuesday morning, I stood before a projection screen displaying the revised emergency protocol framework. Multi-factor authentication, mandatory secondary justification fields that could not accept blank uploads, automatic escalation if documentation lacked substantive metadata, no loopholes disguised as efficiency. A senior operations director raised a hand. Isn't this excessive? The question floated lightly, but beneath it lingered discomfort. Excess is subjective, I replied calmly. Risk is measurable. A pause followed. No one argued with measurable. By Thursday, the company-wide training session on compliance transparency was mandatory attendance for all executive-level leaders. I watched from the back of the room as external forensics presented neutral slides about documentation, integrity, and metadata trails. No names were mentioned. They didn't need to be. The absence was louder than any reference. Midway through the presentation, my phone buzzed softly. A message from counsel. Formal review concludes tomorrow. Recommendation likely permanent. Permanent. Temporary structures have a way of becoming permanent when they function better than what they replaced. Later that afternoon, I passed the CEO's former office. The nameplate had been removed. The glass walls stood bare, sunlight pouring in unobstructed. There's something revealing about an empty office once filled with certainty. For a fleeting second, sympathy returned, not for the decisions made, but for the illusion that systems are ornamental. They are not ornamental. They are patient. At 5:16 p.m., my inbox delivered the final report summary. Findings. Executive misuse of emergency protocol. Evidence confirmed through metadata analysis and archival routing. Impact. Governance breach requiring leadership change. Recommendation. Permanent removal from executive role. No dramatic adjectives. No moral commentary. Just conclusion. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the final wave crest. Not shock this time, but resolution. The board chair requested a brief meeting the next morning. When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere was calm. Lighter, not celebratory, measured. We appreciate the integrity with which you handled this, the chair said. There was no retaliation, no spectacle, only process. Process. That word carried quiet pride. You understood that the system was stronger than any individual, she continued. That's rare. I met her gaze evenly. The system only works if it's used. A faint smile crossed her face. We would like to formalize your role as Director of Governance Oversight, reporting directly to the board. The title didn't thrill me. The structure did. Direct reporting meant independence preserved, not as an exception, but as design. I accept, I said. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then steady, rinsing the glass facade in silver lines. The city blurred slightly beyond the windows, but the building felt clearer than ever. That evening, I retrieved my badge from its clip and turned it over in my hand. Badge access, board clearance, forensics, not symbols of power, symbols of accountability. I thought back to the moment in the executive boardroom when security had been summoned as punctuation, a public dismissal intended to close a narrative neatly. Instead, it had opened one. Not because I fought loudly, because I documented quietly. The next week, internal communications announced the permanent leadership transition. The tone was steady, forward-looking, focused on resilience. Employees adapted quickly. They always do when transparency replaces uncertainty. As for me, my office moved one floor higher, closer to the board, further from spectacle. From that vantage point, the city still shimmered at dusk. Traffic still flowed, clouds still gathered and dissolved without ceremony. But inside the company, something fundamental had shifted. Emergency protocols were no longer shortcuts. Oversight was no longer symbolic. And board clearance was no longer underestimated. I clipped the badge back onto my jacket, feeling its familiar weight. Not heavy, just balanced. Some victories echo, others endure quietly, written into policy, embedded into systems, sealed into memory. This one would endure. 3 months later, the building felt lighter, not louder, not softer, just aligned. Glass still reflected the skyline in perfect symmetry, but the energy inside the corridors had shifted from guarded to deliberate. Meetings started on time. Agendas circulated in advance. Emergency protocol hadn't been triggered once, not because urgency vanished, because discipline replaced improvisation. From my new office, smaller than the former CEO's, intentionally so, I could see both the executive floor and the board wing. The architecture mirrored the reporting line, close enough for collaboration, distant enough for independence. That distance mattered. On a quiet Monday morning, I reviewed the quarterly governance transparency report before it went to the board. Clean, structured, no red flags blinking in sterile blue. External forensics had completed their engagement weeks ago. Their final recommendation was simple: monitoring architecture effective, maintain independence. Maintain independence. It sounded almost philosophical. It wasn't. It was structural. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The newly appointed CEO stepped inside, not with spectacle, not with entourage, just a tablet in hand and a question in his eyes. I wanted to review the updated oversight thresholds before our expansion vote, he said. He didn't need my permission. He wanted alignment. We stood side by side at the screen, scrolling through compliance matrices and reporting triggers. He asked direct questions, listened to the answers, adjusted language in real time. No defensiveness, no bypasses. When we finished, he nodded once. This protects all of us. It did. That afternoon, a company-wide town hall streamed live across every office and remote connection. The new CEO spoke about resilience, about learning curves, about the strength of governance when it's allowed to function. He didn't reference the past explicitly. He didn't need to, because everyone remembered the shift. In the audience, I noticed something subtle. Employees weren't watching nervously. They weren't whispering speculation. They were listening. Trust doesn't return dramatically. It returns incrementally. After the town hall, I walked through the lobby where sunlight filtered through the atrium in long, confident beams. Conversations flowed normally. Laughter sounded unforced. At the reception desk, a new hire struggled with her badge access setup. IT guided her patiently through the process. It won't activate full permissions without documentation approval, the technician explained. Even if it's urgent? She asked. Especially if it's urgent, he replied. I smiled to myself. Especially if it's urgent. Upstairs, the evidence tray that once held my badge had long since been cleared. The conference room where security had waited at the door now hosted quarterly risk reviews. Same table, different energy. Near the end of the day, an internal message appeared in my inbox from the board chair. Governance audit passed without recommendation. Thank you. Simple, complete, no dramatic punctuation. I leaned back and let the quiet settle. There had been no revenge, no public humiliation, no raised voices echoing down marble halls. Only documentation, only process, only structure doing exactly what it was designed to do, once someone trusted it enough to let it. As evening approached, the city lights blinked on one by one, reflections dancing across the glass facade like quiet applause. I unclipped my badge and placed it briefly on my desk. Badge access, board clearance, forensics, once underestimated, now foundational. I clipped it back into place and turned off the lights. Power, I had learned, isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the system that remains standing after the noise fades. And this system was standing, steady, accountable, enduring.